Hi, everyone. Can everybody hear me? We're doing okay? All right. We can always get the mic up if we need to. Do we need the mic up anymore, or are we okay? A little more in the back? Okay. Okay, how's that? Better? Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for the feedback. Appreciate that. Hello, everyone. It's so nice to see this room so full. Welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening at the Traverse Area District Library. Before I introduce this evening's program, I just want to remind you that we've got lots of author events and local interest programs that we have every month. So please be sure to check out our upcoming events on tattle.org/events. And now on to this evening. After several years working as a sports editor in Juneau, Alaska, Jim DuFresne spent the winter of 1981 in New Zealand backpacking and then wrote his first book, Tramping in New Zealand, for Lonely Planet. He followed up with Lonely Planet's Alaska travel guidebook and then returned to Michigan, where he wrote Isle Royale National Park Foot Trails and Water Routes. That guide to the wilderness area of Isle Royale, known at the park as the Backpacker's Bible, is in its 40th year of continuous publication in various editions. Having reached that amazing milestone, Jim has decided to wrap up his career with this presentation entitled The End of the Trail, a Life Well Spent Walking in the Woods and Sleeping on the Ground. He's going to take us into the wilds of New Zealand, Alaska, and of course, Isle Royale here in Michigan. Among Jim's more than 20 published titles are Backpacking in Michigan and 12 Classic Trout Streams in Michigan, a handbook for fly anglers, The Trails of M22, and Porcupine Mountains Wilderness State Park, as well as 50 hikes in Michigan. So please join me this evening in welcoming Jim DuFresne for his farewell tour.
I'm going to move right into the show because you're going to learn more about me than you probably want to know. But I just want to say two things. Some of the slides are a little fuzzy because they're 40 years old, but they really demonstrate or will give you a hint what I was going through. And also afterwards, I'll be in the other room. And if any of you wanted one of my books or whatever, and that'd be great. We'll be selling them. And otherwise, I'm really happy to be here. Let's start the presentation. And the lights. These are better seen in the dark. In 1978, 7 months after graduating from Michigan State, I applied and was offered the sports editor's job in Juneau, Alaska, sight unseen. When the editor offered me the position, he asked when I could start. I told him, well, my brother's getting married next week, but right after that, I'm jumping in my car. I'm driving straight for Juneau. There was a long pause. And finally he said, yeah, well, you can't actually drive to Juneau, right? Loading my car in Alaska State Ferry in Seattle for a 3.5-day cruise into Juneau was my first indication that this was going to be a life-altering adventure for me. The second was when I saw my desk in the newsroom. I had interned the previous 2 summers in the Detroit News sports department where they already had computers with word processing programs. At the Southeast Alaska Empire, I had an old typewriter that was being fed by a box of yellow paper from the floor. What really amazed me was the rotary dial phone. Keep in mind, this was 1978. I remember staring at the phone when the editor said, "Oh, by the way, you're also responsible for Thursday's outdoor page." I was totally unprepared for the temperate rainforest. From the day I arrived, which was in the final week of September, to the first week in November, it rained every day. Sometimes downpours, sometimes just steady drizzles, but it rained every day. My third day there, someone told me, go buy a pair of Southeast sneakers, the brown rubber boots that every local wears almost year round. I did. And I don't think I took them off more than a dozen times that first year. Finally, in early November, the rain stopped. The sky cleared. The mountains around Juneau were so stunning, I loaded up my backpack and followed the Dan Mower Trail into the Alpine until the snow stopped me. I pitched my tent that night and watched alpenglow spread across the peaks around me and the lights of Juneau twinkle below me. I knew then this is where I wanted to be. 2 years later, I quit my sports editor's position because all I wanted to write about was the kayaking, backpacking, glacier trekking, and wilderness travel I had fallen in love with. A city you can't drive in or out of can get kind of claustrophobic after a while. Approaching my third Alaska winter, an Australian friend told me I would love New Zealand. I knew nothing about New Zealand other than it was summer down there. But I went. I landed in Auckland and jumped on the first bus to escape that sprawling city. Anyhow, what I quickly discovered is that New Zealand was mountainous from head to toe. Not just the Southern Alps and the South Island, there were mountains everywhere. I also discovered that New Zealand was an outdoor loving country. Like the mountains, or maybe because of them, there were tracks, what we call trails, everywhere. You never had to go far to find a footpath leading from a road into the Alpine. So you throw a rucksack together and you follow it for a few days. To us, this is backpacking. To the Kiwis, they call it tramping. And I fell in love with tramping in New Zealand immediately. It was refreshing not to have to bear-proof my camp every night like I did in Alaska, because there's no bears in New Zealand. Actually, New Zealand probably didn't have any mammals until the British arrived and introduced things like possums, stouts, and red deer. Doesn't mean when you're tramping in New Zealand, you don't encounter a few large ones along the tracks. But they're fairly domesticated. And if you just keep your distance, they'll just stare at you. The other thing New Zealand doesn't have are snakes. And most unusual, they don't have anything that's poisonous. Unlike Australia, where half the reptiles and insects possess enough venom to suddenly end your tramp. But there was one thing I quickly learned to avoid when I was in New Zealand. I didn't mess around with it. Kiwis love to tell Yanks that Vegemite is just like your peanut butter. Don't believe them. It's a black bacteria extract with an incredibly strong odor and taste. It took me 20 years before I could spread it on my morning toast down under. And that's only because there was no peanut butter around. What makes tramping so distinct and such a wonderful experience from backpacking in Michigan is the country's hut system. Spread across New Zealand along every major track, and a lot of obscure ones, are almost 1,000 backcountry huts. They're generally spaced out every 4 or 5 hours, and some are capable of easily accommodating up to a couple dozen trekkers. A few, like on the Kepler track, this hut held 50 trampers a night plus a hut warden. Others, most of them actually, are maybe 4 bunks and a tiny wood burning stove in case it snows that night. Eight, 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 eight. Looks like half the country. But if it's raining and the wind's howling, you snuggle in your sleeping bag at night and you thank the New Zealanders for the roof over your head. The most enjoyable moments I ever experienced as a backpacker was clearing the tree line in New Zealand and then seeing a hut where I was bunking for the night. There is no feeling like that in Michigan. I've probably been to New Zealand, I don't know, 10 times, 12 times to update my Lonely Planet guidebook. I worked at it for 35 years. But one of those trips lasted 2 or 3 months. And of all the tracks I walked during that time, the Heaphy was my favorite. Located in the northwest corner of the South Island, the Heaphy is a 47-mile trek that takes up to 4 days. In 2013, it was designated and upgraded to a Great Walk, the country's collection of their premier tracks. They have reservation systems and large huts. But in 2001, when my daughter arrived to hike it with me, it was still a secondary trail that featured those small, cozy huts I love so much in New Zealand. A former gold rush route in the late 1800s, the Heaphy ignited the New Zealand conservation movement in the 1970s. Excuse me. When the government announced plans to turn this obscure track into a road, the people won. And to a lot of Kiwis, hiking in the Heaphy is something of a pilgrimage to their outdoor heritage. Jessica was a college freshman when she flew down to join me. I had 3 months in New Zealand. She had 3 weeks. Her Christmas break at MSU. Jet lag is always a problem for overseas travelers, but on the Heaphy, it can be particularly rough. That's because most trampers, like 90% of them probably, begin the Heaphy at the north end, where all the elevation for practically the entire hike is gained in the first half of the first day. But being young and only a year removed from her high school cross-country career, Jessica rebounded quickly in the afternoon when the track leveled out. And when we reached the Perry Saddle Hut after a long day, she thought it was the Hilton. The benches and the bunks and mattresses were that inviting. Our second day, we crossed Perry Saddle, a subalpine area of the mountains, and at the beginning, the hiking was fairly easy, thanks to the old miners' road that was left over from the gold rush. Eventually, we returned to a true track. And it wasn't long before Jessica encountered her first New Zealand swing bridge. Always an exciting moment. 2 days later, we reached the original James McKay hut, a tiny little structure on the edge of the mountains that was incredibly comfortable despite its size. It's in a bit of a clearing, and the views were wonderful. In the evening, we caught a sunset and could see the next day's destination. I said, you see that? That's the Heaphy River emptying in the Tasman Sea. That's where we're going to hiking to tomorrow. And that's, I told her, is where we're spending Christmas Eve. We began the day with a descent out of the mountains and then crossed the Heaphy along one of the longest swing bridges I've ever been on. Needless to say, there was a lot of swinging on this bridge. On the other side, we followed the Heaphy through a forest of Niku palms, all the way to where the river meets the sea. It's a surprisingly wonderful change of vegetation. You go from alpine to palm trees in one day. The hut we stayed on Christmas Eve, along with another New Zealand couple and a young man from Canada, this was it. That hut is gone now. It's been replaced by a much larger one when the Heaphy became a great walk. I love this old hut. I must have stayed at 3 or 4 times in my years in New Zealand. It's in a remote location. You can only get to it by hiking, and it overlooks the Tasman Sea. You can't swim in the Tasman. Its tides and currents are far too violent. So we spent our afternoon beachcombing. It's an amazing what washes out of shore. All kinds of things. Then a half mile from the hut, I saw a small outcropping of rocks in the sea, maybe 10 yards from the beach. I stopped dead in my tracks and I smiled to my daughter and I said, "Oh boy." The backside of the outcropping was covered with New Zealand's famous green lip mussels. I waded in carefully with one arm hanging to that outcropping. I used my Swiss Army knife to dislodge a huge section of them. That evening, we steamed them and with a clove of fresh garlic that somehow we still had in my backpack, paired them up with our last packets of cup of soup. It was great. It was the finest Christmas Eve dinner I've ever had. After a rousing evening of singing Christmas carols with people we'd only met that day, Jessica and I watched another sunset over the Tasman Sea. And I said to her, "Well, tomorrow's our last day on the Heaphy. And if we get, and it's also Christmas tomorrow, and if we get an early start, we can make the Christmas Day buffet at the resort we're staying at that night." The next morning, someone gave me a shove in my bunk at 6 a.m. And when I opened my eyes, there was Jessica dressed. She said, "We are not missing that Christmas Day buffet." We were out the door in 15 minutes, watching the sunrise as we hiked south along the Tasman. This is one of the most scenic stretches of track in New Zealand. It hugs the sea most of the way, except when it occasionally dips into the forested bluffs that line much of the beaches. After the first 15 minutes, I never saw my daughter. She was that far ahead of me. Finally, I dipped into the forest, hiked, descended back out, popped out at a large grassy clearing, and there she was, patiently waiting for me. What takes most people 5 hours to walk, we did it in 3. From a courtesy phone at the trailhead, we rang up to the resort and they sent out a van to pick us up. We didn't just make the Christmas Day buffet, we were the first in line. After that first winter in New Zealand, I returned to Juneau and guided another season for Alaska Discovery. Its nickname was Act Disco. And eventually it was absorbed by Mountain Travel. But back then it was a great little company. All the guides were young and single because they only paid us $125 a day. And that was only when you were actually guiding. No health insurance, no pensions, no sick days. but the expeditions we did were amazing. Our bread and butter was a half-day glacier walks across the Mendenhall Glacier. And at the end, we'd serve these cruise ship passengers, mostly who our clientele was then, a glass and a souvenir cup, by the way, of Mendenhall Madness. I'm not sure what was in it, but I knew there was a shot of rum and some glacier ice. They loved it. We were always tipped very well when we did that. But our forte was kayaking in Glacier Bay National Park. Glacier Bay is a 3.2 million acre park northwest of Juneau. It includes a stretch along the Pacific Ocean, the Fairweather Mountains, and part of the wild Tashnahene River. But its playgrounds are its inner bays. We rented the kayaks to independent paddlers, and we ran guided trips. There were few cruise ships back then, but not like today. And they always were restricted to the West Bay. The East Bay was for kayakers and the once-a-day turboat. And most kayakers would utilize the turboat. They'd be dropped off deep in the East Bay and picked up deep in the bay several days later. So they could spend all their time paddling around ice. With the support of Alaska Discovery, I spent more than 2 months in Glacier Bay in 1985, working on my guidebook to the park. And I started out by paddling the length of the bay from Bartlett Cove, where the park headquarters is, in the lodge. It was while paddling this big water that had my most incredible wildlife encounter ever. When suddenly I spotted what I was pretty sure a whale surfacing a half-mile away. I wasn't surprised. It's estimated that almost 250 humpback whales migrate to Glacier Bay every summer. I stopped and watched it in fascination. It rolled a couple times, and then with a flip of its tail, disappeared. But it wasn't long before I knew where that whale was, and I certainly knew where it was heading. Moving towards me was a clear patch in the ripple surface of the bay, with an occasional explosion of air. I don't remember being nervous. Instead, I remember putting down my paddle and picking up my camera and watched this watery path through the viewfinder. This was before digital cameras. So when less than 15 yards, that's 15 yards to my left, this 40-ton whale broke the surface and my viewfinder went black. I instinctively shot this picture and was so excited, maybe jittery, that I couldn't advance the film. Film, not digital shots. I fumbled too long. I had to pull the camera down. And when I looked up, I missed the picture of a lifetime. The one that always appears on the cover of Alaska magazine at least once a year. That huge fluke of the whale shaking off a rainbow of mist and water, giving one last powerful thrust that would send it to the depths of the bay. I sat in that kayak 20 minutes, reliving that moment before I picked up my paddle and continued north. From the seat of a kayak, seeing a 30-foot long whale, no matter how far away is from you, is what makes Glacier Bay so special. But what really, captures the imagination of kayakers is the ice. There were 16 active tidewater glaciers when I was there. Now, because of climate warming, there are only 11, but 8 of them, like the Grand Pacific Glacier you're looking at, are located in the inland bays, inside bays. There's nothing like it in Michigan. You carefully weave through the ice, especially if you're in a collapsible klepper like I was often, or around the ice. You can spend hours watching seals on the ice, watching you. There are times that the ice dwarfs you in your tiny little boat. And there are times you're sitting in a theater of ice, watching the power of the tides create giant icebergs right in front of you. I got to be honest with you, the best happy hour I ever had guiding was in Glacier Bay. When at the end of a long day, we'd go down and with our little Swiss Army knives, chip 1,000-year-old glacial ice off the icebergs on the beach into our metal cups, and then take it back to their camp for our clients. But in 1985, I was paddling solo, occasionally seeing other kayakers, but I was pretty much by myself every night. One day I met the turbo and exchanged a plastic bag of trash for one that had more food, a couple of novels, and a handful of letters from home. Then I continued into an area of the park that had no glaciers, no ice, and no people. I went 12 days without seeing a person, a boat, or a float plane overhead. This was before cell phones and the internet. So the only conversations I had was when I talked to myself. I'd gone 2 or 3 days alone in the wilderness before this, but nothing like this time. The height of this stretch, without seeing anybody, was day 6 or 7. I found a wayward crab pot like this one washed ashore. It's a recreational pot because commercial crabbers are banned from the park. Could have been one from the Alaska Discovery trip. We set them up often when we were guiding back there. So I knew what I was doing, except I had to find bait for it. And I looked in my food bag, and the only thing that wasn't freeze dried was my last chunk of hard salami. It was tough to give it up. Big decision. I did it. Oh my God, did it pay off. The next day, I pulled that pot up, and to my delight, there was a half dozen Dungeness crabs in it. I cooked them all morning. Took the morning off. That's because I had to cut them in half. My little pot was only so big. I ate 3 for breakfast. Took the others, and I ate the other 3 that night for dinner. In the middle of a 12-day journey, it was the best thing I could possibly come across. By day 12, I was paddling up the west arm and saw a small cove that looked perfect to set up camp. I paddled into it, and then to my delight, there was another kayaker already beached. I jumped out and quickly introduced myself with probably a crazy look on my face, and then said, "You're the first people I've seen in 12 days. They looked at me and they said, "We just got married and we're on our honeymoon." Didn't matter. Spent the entire evening talking to him anyhow. Nobody, not even newlyweds, could have stopped me from rambling endlessly into the night. In 1982, 8 months after moving back to Michigan, I boarded the Ranger 3 in Houghton to spend 2 months at Isle Royale. I had an assignment from the editor of the Detroit News Sunday magazine, but what I really wanted to do was write a guidebook for the park. In New Zealand, I was heavily influenced by Philip Temple. He's one of the country's most honored authors for his historic nonfiction novels, even kids' books. But he started his career by writing trail guides, no doubt to pay the bills. I could really relate to that. And I was intrigued by how he wrapped history and nature and even his sense of adventure in describing trails. Park officials were eager for me to do the same, but were caught off guard when I showed up with a kayak. They said they only seen 2 kayakers the entire previous summer. Fresh from Alaska, I said, sea kayaking, Isle Royale is sea kayaking country. Even if there are no kayaks here, it's going to change. It did. I saw 4 that summer. I needed to hike all the trails, of course, but what I really wanted to do was circumnavigate the island. I'm sure someone had already done it by then, but maybe even from a canoe. But this was pre-internet. I couldn't find much information about it or how challenging it was. My first day was easy, a scenic paddle down Rock Harbor Inlet to Daisy Farm Campground, the largest backcountry campground in the park, featuring 16 of those beloved three-sided shelters, which are still around and are still used. But the next day I woke up, poked out my tent, and saw this. Yeah, windy conditions and big waves. And they remained the following day. Tired of waiting, I changed my plans. Instead of following the outside coast to Chippewa Harbor, this was my intention, I did this. I went inland and I portaged twice to get there. There is nothing glamorous about portaging. It's a grunt. In my case, it was really painful because I had over 2 weeks of food with me and very little had been eaten by then. But I was smart enough to build a portage yoke for my kayak before I left for Isle Royale. And I used it to get into Lake Ritchie, one of my favorite spots in the park. It has a very secluded canoe campground, one of only 4 in the park that only paddlers can reach. And it has wonderful pike fishing. Still, after 2 of the longest portages on the island, each one more than a mile long, and remember, when you portage, you usually have to do it 2 or 3 times, it was great to get back on the open water, confirming to me why this was going to be kayak country. Kayaking is an easy way to travel, and scenery is a lot more intriguing in open water than hiking down a trail where you're kind of closed in by forest. Often by kayaking, even more than canoeing, you can get a rustic view of the Isle Royale's incredible history. There were old fish camps and abandoned boats, cabins and lighthouses, and even the remains of resorts that dotted the islands in the 1920s, welcoming guests who arrived by steamship from Chicago. There are 3 challenges when circumnavigating Isle Royale, and there are ways to safely bypass all of them. The first for me was Cisco Bay. The inclination here is to paddle across the bay from the backside of Hay Bay to Fisherman's Home Cove. But that includes more than 3 miles of open water. The alternative is to follow the shoreline of the bay, but that's an additional 12 miles of paddle. I chose the open water. And halfway through the bay, I ran into unexpected wind and waves and broke my old wooden klepper paddle. When I wrote this piece for the Detroit News, I sent them 100 slides from my trip. And of course, the one they picked on the cover of the magazine was my broken paddle. Took a lot of crap from my kayaking friends, let me tell you. But I had a spare behind me and I whipped it out and continued the journey. And my adrenaline was still racing when I pulled into the quiet waters of Fisherman's Home Cove. I'll never forget this day. Fisherman's Home Cove is a fish camp, and still active fish camp back then, of several buildings that dates back to the early 1900s. There were still reels for drying nets back then when I was there. That building on the dock, it was a sauna. And I was offered the use of it by someone who was staying there. No doubt I really must have smelled pretty bad by then. You'd go in, you'd stoke up that wood burning stove, and you'd sit in there and you'd throw a few rocks on it, and you'd work out 2 weeks of sweat and grind. And then you'd step outside and jump in Lake Superior. When I was done and moving on, I was clean and the most mellow I've ever been in years. On the way to Wendigo, I also portaged my kayak into Feldman Lake for a couple of days. I don't know how many people had actually carried a boat into the lake that summer. I don't think too many. It'd be a rough place to reach by canoe. The 6 backpackers camped there that night were delighted when I assembled my spinning rod and paddled out to the middle of the lake. The northern pike fishing was phenomenal. Everybody feasted that night on fresh fillets. At Wendigo, I stashed my kayak for a little over a week to hike area trails, wait for more supplies to arrive from Rock Harbor, and befriended a park maintenance worker who repaired my paddle. I was now faced with the toughest stretch of any circumnavigation of Isle Royale, the notorious wall. When a high-pressure system settled in, I finally departed Wendigo. I paddled out of Washington Harbor, gliding gently across Isle Royale's most famous shipwreck, the America, whose bow is only 3 feet below the surface. And then I continued around the northwest corner of the island to Hugging Cove Campground. Set up tent, spent the night. And then the next morning at sunrise, when the lake was smooth and the wind non-existent, I pushed off. Because Hugging Cove marks the west end of the wall, Isle Royale's most treacherous shoreline, that most kayakers need 4 to 5 hours to paddle. What makes the wall so challenging is there's no place to pull out for 9 miles. No cove, no beach, just a wall in front of you. It's literally a rock wall, and it's also located in the northwest corner where strong winds often whip across Lake Superior before battering the island. Today, kayakers can pack lightweight weather radios to pick up forecasts from Houghton or Thunder Bay. Back then, they just weren't around. Instead, you started at the crack of dawn and you hustled nonstop until you reached the protection of Little Todd Harbor. Like Cisco Bay, you can safely bypass the wall. You simply load your kayak on the Voyager 3 ferry in Wendigo for a drop-off in McCargo Cove, the gateway to the Five Fingers region of Isle Royale. You get to view the wall from the safety of the boat. Not a bad way to go. The Five Fingers is a series of long, narrow bays and islands, many connected by very short portages, allowing kayakers and canoers to safely paddle in this area of the park. I love it. One of my favorite areas of the park. The water is smooth, it's well protected, the paddling is easy. I've had some of my best wildlife encounters because, unlike a backpacker on a narrow trail, moose don't sense a kayak as being dangerous, and they rarely stop what they're doing. And kayakers can do very well at certain times of the summer for lake trout by simply trolling spoons as they paddle. In 1982, I paddled into Crystal Cove and met Milford Johnson, Isle Royale's last commercial fisherman. Milford was still catching whitefish then and selling them to the Rock Harbor Lodge. I spent several hours talking to him. He was living history. And he was impressed with my kayak and my long journey around the island. He gave me a whitefish. It was one of my best meals on the island that night, fresh. It's a 25-mile paddle from a cargo cove to Rock Harbor, although you can spend a lot more time exploring the area. But getting around the end of the island is the third challenge for kayakers, Lake Point. Lake Point is the northeast tip of Isle Royale, an area that's exposed to a lot of wind. The waves are not only choppy, but they often come to you in two different directions. You can bypass the tip by portaging your kayak over the Greenstone Ridge trail or Greenstone Ridge. That's a brutal climb while carrying a boat over your head. I was resigned to portaging until a power boater in Duncan Narrows campground where I was spending the night offered to tow my kayak around Lake's Point. Was I cheating? Did I truly circumnavigate the island? I don't know. But I've learned two things wandering the wilderness. You can eat really well even if you're sleeping on the ground. And you always want to come home at the end so you can wander again another day. In the mid-1980s, a publisher offered me a contract to write my first non-guidebook. It was an oversized coffee table, hardcover. It contained a dozen of my essays, but I didn't have to worry about how much it costs, where to go, or where you get more information from. And it was surrounded by stunning photography. None of mine, of course. The book never made it to a second printing, and neither did the publishing company. It shut down 6 months after my title was released. I don't think it was my fault, but I never wrote another hardcover book again. Just after my first children's guidebook was released, Booth Newspapers, a chain of dailies, approached me about writing a column, weekly column called Kid Ventures. The first one appeared in August of 1989, featuring my 5-year-old daughter, Jessica, camping on a camping adventure to South Manitou Island. The column was an immediate hit with readers. I realized the second year when I told the editors I needed a 2-month break to update my guidebook in New Zealand, and they asked me to stockpile 8 Kid Ventures before I went down under. I learned a lot hauling my kids across Michigan. I learned it can get really cold in Lake Superior, even in August. To this day, I've never asked them if they were embarrassed walking around a campground with socks on their hands. I learned children can do a lot more outdoors than their parents think they can. I learned they absorb whatever you love in the outdoors. And I learned they grow up fast. The column ran for 14 years. That's an amazingly long time for a column. And then it ended because my kids were off to college. One of my editors said, well, hey, it's time for grandkid ventures. But the reality is, the kid ventures never really stopped. In 2011, Michael, my son, was at his first job after college when he had a week off and a free airline ticket for giving up his seat. I told him to meet me in Juneau at the end of my Lonely Planet research trip, and we'll do a little alpine trekking. When he arrived, we jumped on the state ferry for Skagway to hike the Chilkoot Trail, one of the greatest adventures, not just in Alaska, but anywhere in the country. The Chilkoot Trail begins just outside Skagway and winds 35 miles from the U.S. into the British Columbia to Lake Bennett, that's almost in the Yukon Territory. Along the way, you climb the Chilkoot Pass and traverse year-round snowfields. The route was made famous by the Klondike Gold Rush, which began in 1896 and was over by 1900. But in between, thousands sold everything they owned to finance a trip across the trail to the gold fields of Dawson City. In the winter of 1987 alone, 30,000 prospectors climbed the Chilkoot Pass, each hauling a year's worth of supply as required by the Royal Canadian Mounties stationed at the top. The Chilkoot is not just an alpine trek, it's a walk through history, because the trail is littered from one end to the other with artifacts from the gold rush, from a giant saw blade and huge mining dredges to a rusty coffee pot on the side of the trail. Because of its popularity, you have to stay in designated campgrounds and need to reserve your place in the trail in advance. They limit the number of trekkers on the Chilkoot. It's that popular. But each campground has a warming cabin filled with photos of the gold rush and artifacts where trekkers gather in the evening. Our first night after a long day on the trail, we were playing cribbage in one of them when Michael said, I brought some pain medication for us, and promptly pulled out a half pint of pretty good whiskey out of his backpack. I smiled. I said, son, this is my third time across the Chilkoot, and I'm telling you, that's not enough pain medication for the both of us. I then pulled a fifth out of my backpack. It felt good that I could still teach my son a thing or two about surviving the outdoors. The high point of the hike is crossing the 3,500 foot pass. You begin in Sheep Camp, and the night before, a ranger gives a talk to everybody in camp about that covers trekking through an avalanche zone and the need to start early in the morning, because the sun loosens up things by the afternoon. Michael and I didn't waste any time. We were packed and the first on the trails by 5:35 in the morning. It was already daylight for an hour. Adrenaline was flowing as we steadily climbed toward the pass. The final leg is the Golden Staircase, that during the Klondike was 1,500 steps chopped out of ice and snow. This is probably one of the most famous photographs, and the Klondike was well photographed, of these prospectors climbing up with their gear, dropping them off, and then had to come back to get more. In the summer, it's a 30-degree incline of boulders and rusty cables left over from the gold rush that you struggle up on all fours to climb, using the cables from time to time and hoping they're still pretty well anchored in the stone. This isn't a particularly high pass, but when you reach the top, that Klondike sense of adventure overwhelms you. And when a backcountry ranger comes along, a member of the Royal Canadian Mounties, and says you're the first to cross that day, it's a most satisfying moment. 2 days later, we reached Lake Bennett and its huge railroad depot, seemingly in the middle of nowhere. It was the White Pass and Yukon Railroad that made the Chilkoot obsolete when it was completed in the 1900s. Today, the railroad is a scenic ride and the depot a huge dining hall for cruise ship passengers. But there is a room in the back for all of us who haven't taken a shower in 4 days. They serve us a Stampeder's meal, pots of beef stew, hot loaves of bread that you slathered with real butter, and apple pie. Everything is enjoyed with freshly brewed coffee. After such a meal, you go outside and you wait for the historic narrow gauge railroad to return and take you back to Skagway. Backpackers, of course, get their own car in the back because we still hadn't taken a shower yet. In the winter of 1983-84, the first edition of Isle Royale National Park Foot Trails and Water Routes was released. It was a thin book of 130 pages, hand-drawn maps, and fuzzy black and white photos because all I shot was Kodachrome film when I was on the island. But it was the first paddler's guide to any area in Michigan. Jerry Dennis's classic Canoeing Michigan Rivers didn't appear for another 3 years. And it was really the first guidebook to trails in Michigan, as opposed to just a collection of maps. It's done well. This winter, the book enters its 40th year of continuous publication in various editions. For 40 years, you could step off on Rock Harbor and Isle Royale and their ranger station, and there it was on the shelf if you wanted to buy a copy. It's the most satisfying achievement of my career. And recently I decided to wrap it up while I still had the creativity, energy, and passion to finish other non-commercial projects. I could spend an hour or more thanking people who helped me along the way, starting with my wife, whom I'll never understand why she agreed to marry an unemployed writer 40 years ago. But the people I need to thank the most are you. Everybody in this audience, everybody I've met on the trail or have attended one of my presentations, everybody who has sent me hundreds of letters over the years and twice as many emails or Facebook postings. And most of all, everybody who has purchased one of my books, had a great adventure, and then purchased another. In the beginning, I didn't know how, didn't know if I could possibly make a living writing outdoor recreational guidebooks. No one was doing it. But thanks to all your support and encouragement, this is the only trail I've ever followed, a path of my own choosing. And I don't know how to show my deep appreciation for all that you gave me, except to say, thank you. Thank you, and I'll see you on the trail. Again, I really appreciate this crowd. This is great, and I really appreciate your support. So I get emotional at the end. It's kind of like my retirement party. Anyhow, I'll be in the other room. If you want to talk, ask me questions, buy a book, sign up one that you brought in. That's fine too. I'm really touched by that, but I do charge a couple bucks for the autograph. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, everyone, for coming this evening. If you have questions for Jim, be sure to go ahead and get in line and interact with him. I'm sure he'd love to chat with you. Thank you so much.